Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Education Part 2, Administration. So it's very easy to be cynical and critical and assault administration, which of course I'll be happy to do. But I want to start with a caveat of understanding the problem that administering education faces, but particularly in the United States. I'm sure this is true around the world and other places, but in the U.S. particularly, which is what I'm most familiar with and have done the most research on. And that is, as I mentioned in the last lecture, is they don't know what they're supposed to be doing. They have no idea. Are they supposed to be producing citizens? Are they supposed to be preparing people for the workforce? Are they supposed to be primarily a babysitting service? This is pretty much what they're supposed to be. And hence you have to imagine, okay, if you're in charge of a car factory, you can at least tell whether or not you're producing cars. If you're supposed to be producing pizzas, you can tell if someone's making pizza. If you're supposed to deliver a product, even if the product is crap, at least you can tell whether or not something has shown up. With education, there's no agreement on what it is you're trying to do and what you're trying to produce, and therefore there's no way of knowing whether or not what you're doing is actually a reasonably good or bad job. And so what do you do in this environment? Well, what you do is you have to create something. And first thing you need to do is create a goal. And the natural inclination of administration, not just in education, but in all cases, and in education is particularly strong because, again, they don't have other goals to strive for. An external goal has to be all internal, is to maximize the employment of administrators. And it sounds like a joke. It is kind of a joke, but it's actually perfectly reasonable within the context in which they're working. One way you know that this is true is there's been an increase in the rate of administration in both K through 12 and in higher education in the United States. The ratio of administration has increased rather markedly over the last 20 years. Also, if you look at something like pay, principals, for instance, at high schools and elementary schools generally earn double to triple what the teacher, an average principal will earn double or triple what an average teacher would make. In college, it just goes even crazier. They're making 10 to 20 times a college president what a professor makes. Most of the higher administration will make vastly more money than most of the professors. And this tells you immediately what the institution values. The institution values the administration because the administration is what matters. They're the people that are hard to get. They're the expertise that really counts, and therefore you have to compensate them more highly. And people will say, there's all kinds of excuses for this. But I would like to point out, as before we get too far into this, that one way of understanding the Silicon Valley revolution is that it was engineers and technical specialists who went to business administrators, CEOs, these sorts of people and said, look, we think we should be compensated for our intellectual property the way you are. And they said, no. Look, we do the business, you work for us, you're just doing low-level stuff. It's really the business stuff that matters. And some of them went to Silicon Valley and other places and said, hey, you know what? Forget that. We're going to start our own companies and we're going to compensate the technical expertise. We're going to compensate the engineers and then later the programmers and developers as if they were, in fact, business administrators, as if they were the accountants and the CFO, these kinds of people. And that transformed the industry, because all of a sudden all the emphasis got put in a very different way. This has not happened, of course, in education. Education still has the old model, which is, those administrative people are more important than the people who do the theoretical work of what's supposed to matter. But we all know, of course, it doesn't matter, and that's why you don't compensate them. So the goal of administration is to increase the number of administrators. And the reason this is the goal of administration is perfectly rational. So again, there is no external goal that anybody agrees on. So you have to come up with an internal goal. So what they're busily doing is creating work for administrators. And so the clearest example of this, although not the only, and we'll look at some other ones, for K through 12 is the testing craze that has taken over the country in the last 20 to 30 years. And what's important to note for those of you outside the United States, several times in your educational career as a K through 12 student, you will take a state mandated test that was supposed to tell the state how your school is doing. So this test measures the success of the school at meeting certain criteria. And then based on the outcome of that test, they make changes. This is all theoretical, of course. You would make changes in the policy or education or what's going on. And then ideally, this would slowly improve over time the quality of the schools. Now, a couple of things as the background here is over the last 30 years, there's been essentially not much improvement that you can verify. So it's not that schools are doing a worse job. It's not that they're doing a better job. Minorities have improved somewhat. There's been an improvement in the performance of minority students to a certain degree. And that's about it. Dropout rates have not altered that much. And but the other side is you can't blame administrators too much. You can blame them somewhat, but because spending has also been very flat for the last 30 years. In fact, actually declined in the last couple of years, the great economic collapse there that we threw in the 2008-ish time range. And then I don't think it's fully recovered in most states. Again, 50 states, 50 budgets. So there's some variability here, but I think most states are not actually back in inflation-adjusted dollars. Now, there has been, on average, again, this varies by state, some increase in spending over the last 3 years, adjusted for inflation and per student. But almost all of that increase has gone to two places. One, special education. So, that's good if you think about that, but it was a new federal mandate, so states had to spend a lot more money on very few students, and it really didn't affect the general population that much. And two, technology. Huge investment in infrastructure for technology. So here's administrators. They have basically no more resources, and they're supposed to produce better results. So this is tricky, right? So this is a challenge, and you're supposed to do this with a test. So this test is supposed to tell you how you're doing. Okay, infinite amount of problems here. One of the things that the states do is they constantly change the test they're giving. So they'll give one kind of test for a couple of years, and they'll switch to a different test, and then they'll switch to a different test. Washington State, where I am, I think is on their fourth or fifth test in the last 20 years. California just switched over, I think 5 or 6 years ago, to a completely different test. Often many states, California included, Texas I believe also, give several different tests. So one, they keep changing the tests over time. Two, they give different tests at the same time, because they'll have, if you don't pass this test, you can have an alternative test. Excuse me. And also they tend to vary the test itself while they're so they'll come up with a new standard test, and then they'll give it for a few years, and they'll say, oh, well, we need to revamp the test we're using. And so what this means is the results of the test are 100% completely meaningless. So imagine if you were doing a physics experiment and you said, oh yeah, we started the experiment with this device that we were measuring, whatever, gravity or something. And then halfway through, we decided to switch to this other device that measures gravity in a different way. And then we were getting weird results. So we decided to adjust the machine while we were testing it. And then right when we got to the end of the test, we decided to get a different machine again, because we really didn't like that machine. And so we got a third machine that actually worked differently than the previous two machines. And so here's our results. You'd be laughed at. This is these are not scientific results, ladies and gentlemen. This is just nonsense. All of the variables are constantly being varied. And so there is no possible way of knowing whether you're producing any meaningful outcome. Also, all 50 states have the option of using their own tests. So some states use the same test, other states use different tests. So there's no national test. And so what they have to do is then sort of, to try and get a national idea of how education is doing, they kind of try to average the numbers from these different tests. Also, the conditions in which the tests are given are constantly being varied. So they'll give the students more time. They'll give special days. They'll spend more time preparing for the test. Right? So they'll do increasing amount of test preparation to prepare for a test that's supposed to be a test that tells you how you're doing in education generally. But of course, everybody's preparing for the test. So what it really tells you is that how well you're getting your students to prepare for the test. So this is, it's insane, right? Because it doesn't measure anything. And it forces students to participate in a system for which they have no rewards. They're not even pretending to teach the students anything. All they're trying to do is get them to pass this test because it makes the school look good. And so the students end up working for the administration, which, by the way, is not really good for your test scores because students aren't stupid. They realize that, hey, this is just sort of exploitative. And so a lot of states have made it mandatory to pass these tests to graduate, because what they found out is if you didn't, the students were just like, well, screw this. Why should I work on passing this test that does nothing for me? And so they had a lot of many states, most states, I'm pretty sure it's most states. I didn't check all the states, but many states make it mandatory that you pass the state test so that you can graduate, even though it has no relevance to anything else that you're doing. So it's bizarre in every way, but what it does is it gives the administration something to do. So you get to administer the test, you create the test, you change the test, you study the results of the test, you report the results of the studies, you make changes to the testing environment so that you can have different results, and then you analyze those results and argue about what happened, and then you produce more reports, and then you decide that these aren't very good, so let's get a new test, and so then you spend a bunch of time. This is genius. This is brilliant, because you have no verified outcome, it's no relevance to education, and it gives you lots and lots of work to do. And if by chance, for some reason, it appears that you are doing better, and this is where I said maximize administrative employment, if for some reason you all of a sudden something looks like it's working, well, it only makes sense if something looks like it's working and it is doing well that you give it more resources. So any program that's being administered that seems to be producing results, what do? You give it more resources. This is not crazy. This is, if you're selling something and one of your departments sells a lot of stuff, you give them bonuses and you hire some more people to sell more of that stuff. So with administration, everyone is looking for that thing that looks like it's successful, and then they ask for more resources for it, which is reasonable because it is successful, and that success generates more employment. So think about how many administrative personnel and how much time and how much money has gone into testing over the last 20, 30 years, which is verifiably meaningless. And again, that doesn't show any particular impact on success in education. It's if over the last 30 years, education had improved dramatically, and literacy and dropout rates, like all this stuff was like booming, and colleges are like, we don't even have to do remedial courses anymore because the students come in so amazingly prepared. We don't have to do, tutoring or anything, because wow, look at the level has just jumped. I've not read that report. If that report exists, please, email it to me. Haven't seen it, quite the contrary. So all this work is being done that generates all of this material that takes lots of hours and all this specialty and all this money and resources in a totally meaningless fashion. And that is what administration does. This is their goal. And again, on one hand, it's sort of frustrating and irritating. But on the other hand, what is somebody supposed to do in a system which has no clear goal, right? How are you supposed to justify your existence when you don't have an outcome that is going to be agreed upon by the community or by the larger social structures in which you're operating? So it's kind of tricky for them. I'll grant them that. I don't think it covers all sins, but it is a problem. The second thing they have to deal with, this is very tricky, is they have to deal with the state. So you're a smallish, even a large school is a smallish institution relative to the size of whatever state you're in. And the state has very different ideas about education. And of course, as administrations changes and time goes on, they change their ideas of how it should be funded, what goals should we be pursuing, where are we going to put the funding for the next 3 years, and then the next 3 years they pull all that funding and put it into some other program. And so you see this continual rise of programs that are then fall away as new programs come in, and then new programs come in, and then they go away, and then another. And all of this, again, generates all this activity and interest, and then the administrators, not surprisingly, go, oh, look, state is giving more money for whatever it is at the moment for, STEM education. Okay, we're all about science and technology now. So STEM education money is out there. So, of course, as an administrator, you go, there's the money. We want to employ people, administrators, so let's go get a bunch of that STEM money. But they don't care why it's there. They have no investment in STEM as an outcome. They don't actually know what it means because it is, of course, a meaningless term. You hear it all the time. It doesn't mean anything. By the way, it means science, technology, engineering, and math. Science is not a field. Technology is certainly not a field. Engineering is about 30 fields, and no one goes into math. So STEM, there you have it. What do you do with that? Like it's so many different fields with so many different backgrounds and so many different requirements, and two of them, science and technology. What does even technology mean anyway? So I guess if you're a cab driver, is that technology because you're driving a car, an advanced vehicle? No, of course they wouldn't count that. But right, so you have this meaningless acronym to which a lot of money is attached, and that's what we love. We love meaningless acronyms to which money is attached. When the money goes away, we no longer love the acronym. So bye-bye acronym, we'll look for the new acronym that has the money attached. And so it's this constant churn directed at nothing, which is sort of the magic of our system. And this is what administration is busy doing pretty much all of the time. At the college level, what this has led to is just an absolute boom in administration. In fact, there's a great article. I can't decide whether I should link to it or not, because I don't like to link to things that are negative. Maybe I'll put a link in the description. But a PhD person researched the cause of the rise in the cost of higher education, which has risen very much more quickly than inflation. So something like, depending on which state you're in, somewhere between 4 and 8 times the cost. So today, education is between 4 and 8 times higher education than what it cost, I think it's 25 years ago. So that's a significantly huge increase. So why? And she points out in her research, and she goes through this in complete detail, like a lot of this is due to the growth in administration. So many more administrators have been hired, non-faculty, non-teaching, right? So remember, the goal is supposedly teaching, but what have they been doing? They've been hiring administration much faster than they've been hiring teachers. And again, the administration is often much more highly compensated. So it's not just that there's more of them, but they cost more per unit. And so, wow, this is kind of throwing things off completely. And so costs go up. But it's not, by the way, it's not just administration. I want to point that out. There's also been a decline in per student funding in most states. So that's been a big part of it as well. But so several factors, but this has certainly been one of them. And she does a pretty good job of laying this out and cites different studies and, the whole thing. And you're like, wow, okay, there. And then she concludes this. I'm not making this up. Her conclusion is, but of course, that's what you should expect, because this is what you need to run a modern college. And she lists why. And the list of reasons why is precisely what administration does. So number 1 on her list was advising. If students need world-class advising to be able to get their degrees, then you have to have highly trained, knowledgeable advisors. And it's like, that's true, but why is it so freaking complicated? The reason it's so freaking complicated is because this is what administration does. This is back where I mentioned the scribes of old would create really complex, subtle, unbelievably difficult languages, both to write and grammatically, because then it makes it hard to be a scribe. So you win. Haha. No one else can read this or write or understand it or write it. So if you're a scribe, this just, win for you. If you make it really, really simple, then everybody could read and write. And that would be horrible. By the way, this is why in the modern era, if you go from, about, again, 1880 or something, pick a date, to about 1950, German, French, Chinese, of course, English keeps trying in a failing way, have been trying to revise the language. They've been trying, let's simplify it. Let's get rid of Zeitschrift in German. In Chinese, of course, they went to the simplified characters. And, because they're like, hey, we want to expand literacy. And one way to expand literacy is to make literacy easier. But hey, let's get rid of some of these tenses and these unreadable scripts and these symbols that take 800 brushstrokes to make. Can we simplify this for the folks? Can we make it a little more accessible? And it turns out, if you put your mind to it, you can. This is the opposite of that. This is the old scribal trick. And the old scribal trick is make it difficult. So these many years ago, when I was an undergraduate, when you enrolled, you got a book. And that book told you, in one of the pages, here's what you need to do to get your degree, and you just checked it off as you went. And so my entire college career, which was incredibly varied, I only met with an advisor one time, and that was to verify that I had met all the requirements so that I could, in fact, graduate. One meeting, it was about 10 minutes in my entire education as undergraduate. So, wow. Why do we need whole teams? No, so I'm not saying you don't need any advisors. I'm just saying it seems like, why do you need teams of highly trained, highly sophisticated advisors to tell people what classes to take? Because you've made the system unbelievably complex and incredibly difficult to navigate. Ipso facto, you have to have these advisors. So they're doing a lot of work, and the students need the help. So they're not making this up. If you make a system sufficiently complicated that the students can't figure it out, they need help. And so they go to get help, and you're like, look how busy we are. We are incredibly busy. We're logging every student that comes in. We're logging how much time we spend with them. They have so much trouble. Yes, they do have trouble because you've created this mad system that nobody can figure out. If students knew what they needed to take, they wouldn't have to worry about all of the advising, but that would be no good. You also make it impossible to enroll. You create all these barriers, and then you help people over the barriers, and you say, look how busy we are. Look how much work we're doing. Financial aid, if anybody's had anything to do with the financial aid system, enough said. If they could make it any more Byzantine, I don't know. In Washington State, you could fill out your financial aid. I don't know about other states. I'm assuming it's similar, but I know from personal experience in Washington State, students fill out their entire financial aid package. They turn it in, and they say, your financial aid package is complete, with a little asterisk. And the asterisk is, you may be asked to submit more documentation. And a certain percentage, and I think this is federal, a certain percentage of students are automatically asked to submit more documentation. But they often miss this note. And so they're like, I handed everything in. I did everything I was supposed to do. I'm a good person. No, you don't get your financial aid until you hand in more documents. Often students now are at home if they need their documents from their parents, or, so it creates this just crazy system. And so everybody's trying to chase it down, and there's different deadlines. And yeah, you could make the system a lot easier. I'm not sure you could make it that much harder, basically. That would be my guess. And so financial aid is a big problem. And if you go down the list, you just see it over and over again, like, okay, I can see this point, but who's making it this difficult? Right? I can see this point. Why is it like that? Is this really a necessary component of education? And the answer is generally no, not that they aren't good things. Oh, another one, diversity. We should have a diverse faculty and diverse student body. And then they say, therefore, you need, specialists trained in diversity. And I'm like, or one, you could define diversity, which would be an interesting challenge. Two, you can let in a bunch of different people from a bunch of different places and a lot of different backgrounds and hire faculty under that rubric. Is it that complicated? Do we need diversity specialists? Really? We need diversity specialists to figure out, to hire people and to let students in from different backgrounds? And by the way, there's no evidence this is working. By the way, so the other thing is there's little evidence that they're actually massively increasing the diversity of the education system. If they were, you could at least say, hey, they're doing something. But yeah, it's not working out that great yet. Hopefully, maybe, but we'll see. It just seems to me just letting in a bunch of people from different backgrounds would be the way to get diverse student population. But apparently that takes an expert, takes somebody who's studied for years and years and years to do that. Of course, the problem is they just don't want to let that. They just don't want to let those people in. It's pretty simple. We want diversity, but we don't want those people, right? And how you define those people is generally what they mean is we don't want poor students. And because poverty in our country is very closely associated with race, which socioeconomic background. Yeah, we don't want a lot of poor students. Poor students are no good. We want a lot of middle class and rich students. And so I believe the numbers in the like Yale, Harvard, those sort of elite schools, is that there's more students from the 1% than there are students from the bottom 50% of earning, which means it's skewing just a touch rich. Let us say just a touch rich. But again, what does diversity even mean? I mean, we want a lot of foreign students. That's good. They love foreign students because foreign students pay a fortune. We don't want poor students. That's no good. We don't, what, I mean, is somebody who does poorly academically, are they a group? I mean, shouldn't we let some people who don't do that well academically in and see if they just flower in a different environment? That could be a type of diversity. Anyway, so all of these specialties that they decide they need to meet some goals, none of which ever, the goal never seems to be, oh, let's, help people have a much better education. It's all this other extraneous material. And so administration ends up just taking over. Because again, when you have no agreed goal, then they just spend a lot of time generating, fulfilling, and then generating reports about the stuff that they've generated. At the college level, you also have accreditation, which is where outside boards come in and they review the functioning of your college to make sure you're meeting the standards of whatever the accrediting board is. And on one hand, this makes total sense, right? This is theoretically supposed to keep, sort of diploma mills and places like Phoenix University from making billions of dollars off of students. Of course, it didn't and hasn't, but in theory, you can see the idea. The problem is, again, they're just not interested in teaching or learning. So one of the things they're notorious for, and I'm sure, again, there's several accrediting boards, and so you can't say this is universal, but for instance, they don't tend to go and sit in classes, right? So I think one great way to accredit a school would be to get 10 students and say, hey, we're going to hire you to go through in your 4 years and report back every year how your experience is at the school. How are the classes? How are the teachers? How's your interaction? How do you feel about the facility? Are you getting the kind of, see, they don't do that. And the creditors don't come in and sit in the classes because they said, I actually was in an interview with them. I was being interviewed by them as part of our college's accreditation. And I asked them straight out, I said, what did you think of our classes? And they said, oh, we don't have time to sit in classes. We never sit in classes. And I was like, great. That's great, because it's not like classes are a major component of a college experience. So you're testing all the non-class stuff. All the stuff that doesn't have to do with learning seemed to be their real forte. But of course it is, because who's the lowest prestige people? Professors. Who's the lowest paid people? Professors. What's the worst grindy work is students. So you avoid professors, you avoid students, and you generate paperwork with the administration, and you check on things like, to tell you the truth, I can't even imagine what they're checking on. But they're checking on it, and so they generate these massive reports, and it's pretty hard to lose your accreditation. I'd be curious to see just how badly you would have to run a college for them to finally say, you know what? We're pulling your accreditation. For instance, Phoenix University still exists, so it's got to be pretty damn bad. So, it's just this inevitable logic that takes over when you have no clear guidance on what you're trying to achieve. Another part of this, of course, is the problem of students. So in the institution of both K through 12 and higher education, students go away. They come in, they're there for a little while, and then they leave. Teacher and faculty, or faculty and administration, they tend to stay. And so the outlook becomes that students don't matter. And the reason they don't really matter is because they're leaving. Right? No matter what happens, they're going to go away. And so your perspective changes dramatically, and you start going, we have different goals. We have different kinds of outlooks that we want to take on. And you get what they call the institutional mindset, whereas what you become very interested in is the institution, which is not terrible, because it's the structures and the people that are permanent that really attract your attention, that you become attached to, rather than that thing which is transitory. And it's the students that are transitory, and so they tend to move over time. They become less and less important. They're theoretically important, but functionally, you want to ignore them as much as possible. And the one thing that always stuck in my mind, this was an undergraduate, I had an experience that where my eyes were sort of opened, as it were. And I had to meet a dean. It was when I was transferring out of music composition, and I had to get I think it may have been the dean of the whole Department of Arts and Humanities. Anyway, some very high-ranking administrator I had to get them to sign off on my withdrawal and change of programs and all this, because I'd messed up the paperwork perfectly, understandably, because I was terrible at paperwork and still terrible at paperwork. So that was totally on me. I blew it, so I had to go see the big person. That's not their fault. But so I'm waiting, and it was very hot where I was an undergraduate. And the first thing I noticed was like, oh, it's so beautifully air conditioned in this place. I mean, like beautifully air conditioned. I was like, God, this is so great. And then I noticed like all this furniture is really nice too. And then I had to go to the bathroom, and I went to the bathroom. I'm like, oh, all the rest of the campus, or every place I would ever gone to the bathroom, they had those horrible little pieces like tissue paper, right? Like Kleenex toilet paper that just doesn't work well, and you have to get like 50 sheets out and it all flies all over the place. No, they had really nice rolls of toilet paper. And I'm like, oh, this is it, right? This is, I'm at the place you want to be. And all the other administrators want to be there because they get the nice office and the beautiful bathrooms. It's beautifully air conditioned, and they don't want the students there. You know, I'm only there because I have to have this special meeting, but normally students don't really have a lot of access. They built a new business school while I was an undergraduate, and they tried to say that students were not allowed in the school. I'm not making that up. I know that sounds like it's a joke, because it was such a nice new facility that students were like, oh, we'll go study at the business school because it's a nice, beautiful facility. And they like didn't want students in there hanging out. They did not want them in the building. So they started like trying to rope it off and like only trying to let in students who like classes. And so you had your class you're supposed to leave, and this caused a big hubbub. And finally they said they'd stop doing that. But you're like, wow, you build a business school and then try to keep students from going into it. That just like the greatest, for me, it's always been the metaphor. Then when I was in graduate school, Indiana University, beautiful campus, amazing place. And they did this continually. They were constantly trying to carve out spaces where students weren't allowed, particularly, and again, I know it sounds like I'm making this up, but in the student union. For instance, there was this really big hotel. The student union I use is massive, like just mind-bogglingly huge. And they redid the hotel that's in the student union. And then they tried to tell students they could not go in that part of the student union because they didn't want students in there because it's supposed to be for hotel guests, not for students in the student union, even though the hotel is actually in the middle of the student union. There was also 2 restaurants that they didn't say students couldn't go in, but they did everything they could to keep students from going in. So you weren't actually prohibited from entering. They just let you know that they would prefer if you did not go in, which was hilarious. So, and by the way, so there's a lot more, but these 3 facilities in the student union, they tried to keep students from accessing because students bad, right? This is the rule because they go away, right? You don't really have to worry if you piss them off occasionally. You don't want to piss them off too much. You want to keep them happy. You want to keep them enrolled, but they're going away. So that's not what we're here about. We're interested in the administration. And the higher up in the administration you go, as a rule, the less time you have to spend with students. And to the point where if you're sufficiently high in the administration, you never have to see a student, which is apparently a goal. Now, I'm not saying this is universal. I know some administrators love students and work very hard on their behalf. This is the tenor of the system and the logic of the system, because they're looking for resources to grow their positions, their departments, their fields, and they want those resources. And so they work that direction. And those resources don't come from students. Students do not pay directly to the administration. They pay into some big fund that the administration then decides how to divvy up. And so they're fighting for these kinds of resources. And so the students are basically irrelevant at this point, unless they need them for numbers for some reason. And this pervades the entire outlook. And so what you have is this crazy world of education administration where tasks that you would think would be fairly straightforward and simple, get a bunch of students, let them sign up for whatever classes they want. They take those classes. After a while, they get degrees and go away. And they make it into this absurdly, unimaginably, mind-numbingly, brutally complicated process that no one can figure out, except your administrative specialists. And it's not a mistake. I mean, it's not that it was purposeful in the sense of, hey, they got up one morning and came up with this evil plot, but it is sensible because the incentive structure of an administrative system of an educational institution is precisely this. Make it more difficult, create challenges, make it seem important, gain resources, rinse and repeat, and then you grow and grow and grow until some major shift happens and the whole faction of administration will vanish, and then a new mushroom will appear, and then all the resources will go over there. And this just goes on and on and on. It cycles the resources around. It really doesn't change. It certainly doesn't help education because that's really not what they're interested in, because again, how do you measure it? You can't. So let's forget about that and move on with important things. And the greatest example I love of this, to finish with, and again, I'm trying not to be just cynical. It is, you can just see the logic of this. It's relentless. It's everywhere, and it happens all the time. You see this with IT, and people talk about this in articles. You can read about this. One of the reasons school is more expensive is because this, huge investment in information technology that colleges and K through 12 to a lesser extent have had to make the schools efficient, right? And I'm just like, it's true. They have spent billions and billions of dollars implementing very sophisticated computer systems run by really highly talented people. They're generally understaffed, so it's really sort of, painful that they have to do all this stuff, and they need more resources all the time. But efficient, right? So efficiency is when you spend less money and have fewer people achieving the same results, or you get dramatically better results with either the same resources or a small increase. But what we've done is we've spent vast amounts of money to achieve nothing in particular except maybe making things vastly more difficult and employing lots and lots of IT people in the process. So it's not easier to register for school now than it was 30 years ago. It's not easier to figure out what classes you need to take now than it was 30 years ago. It's not easier to get your financial aid now than it was 30 years ago. Your classes don't run easier because, again, by the way, I'm totally in favor of tech investment in, computer science departments. They should have everything they want. I mean, that makes sense. But the French department, how much technology does the French department need? Biology, I'm sure they need something, but how much do they really need? The library, let's load the library up. That makes sense. Do research and stuff. So this will give the library a lot of resources there. But, what are we doing, right? Why are we spending these just unimaginable amounts of money and time to create systems that achieve, as far as any outcome looks, nothing at all? If anything, it makes everything more difficult. And hey presto, as if just to prove this, there's been a cheating scandal where students, I believe at Yale, were accused of cheating on exams. Well, now the exams are virtual, so hey, technology is taken front and center. And they're using a program called Canvas, which if you've ever seen this program, I'm sorry, your life's quality has been degraded by that. I've never used Canvas. I was supposed to, but I refused. So it's just a horrible interface that's supposed to help students learn. I've never seen any functional utility of it whatsoever. But the students were accused of cheating because while they were doing their tests on their computers at home, they apparently were checking some material on Canvas at the same time, but then that turns out to be whether that's true or not. It's hard to tell. And so the technology that's supposed to help is in fact creating more barriers, more confusion. Several of the students, they actually dismissed the charges against them when it turns out that the computer just generates random reports and nobody knew that was happening because it's not supposed to be used for that. So now they're trying to come up with technology that monitors students who are using the technology to take tests, right? So then that technology turns out to be dubious. So some schools are getting rid of that anti-cheating software because it turns out not to be very effective. So you see, you create a technological problem and then you create a technological solution. And when that solution doesn't work, you create another technological solution to solve that solution, and on and on and on. What you could do is you could just have the students take tests and mail them in, or have students take tests and proctor them, or, do any number of things. But no, you create technology, it creates problems, and then you solve that with more technology, which creates more problems, and down the rabbit hole you go. So again, nothing that's core to education is easier today than it was 20 years ago. Xerox machines are pretty good. I'll give them that. So if you need to photocopy stuff, man, we have nice printers and copiers now. I'll give them that. But the core stuff, what students really want to do, get my classes, get some money so I can take my classes, has not been revolutionized. If anything, it's been de-revolutionized. But we've spent a lot of money and time doing it. So if you want to think about these kinds of examples, and I could go on and on, but I don't want to belabor this, it is that the administrative outlook has so totally dominated how we think about education these days that it's easy to get lost, like completely lost. Like when they say, oh, we need to spend money on technology, it's like, why? Is the computer science department short on funding? Let's then go. Yes, absolutely. But what's all this other stuff for? Is it easier now to enroll in my classes than it was? Answer, probably not. Maybe your system is much better than many that I've looked at for preparing this lecture and in the many years that I've been involved in this. Is it easier to get financial aid? Is it easier to get all this done? Is it faster? Is it quicker? Are they employing vastly fewer people in these departments? And because the technology is working so smooth and so great? Answer, no, absolutely not. The more people doing more work to make it more complicated for the students. And this is not efficiency, by the way. Just like I said, this is the definition of not efficiency. So when we think about education, one thing you must do is or two things at least. You don't have to do anything, of course, do anything you want, but I would recommend to think about it clearly, is always ask, is this an educational problem, i.e. whether or not students are learning, or is this something else, right? Is this an administrative issue, which while it might be important and valuable, whatever, actually does not in any way affect or alter or dramatically improve or reduce the quality of the learning experience for the student? And what you'll find is if you ask that question over and over and over and over again, about 80% of the quote unquote problems or difficulties or challenges that education face have nothing to do with education. They have everything to do with administration. Now, administration has to happen. So I'm not like saying, there can be zero administration, although let us all dream. But what happens is the administrative problems get listed as if they're educational problems, when in fact they are not educational problems. Educational problems is this the best way for a student to intake this information, to learn this, to have this experience, to grow as a person? That's an educational question. Enrollment statistics, test outcomes, staff hierarchies, IT systems, none of those they literally have zero correlation with education. And we know this because, as I mentioned in the first lecture, all of the incredibly brilliant, unbelievably talented, just amazing people from history, almost none of them ever went to any sort of educational institution because they didn't exist. Historically, they just weren't there. And so the question of education is very different from the question of institutional administration. And I just heard a thing about Edith Wharton, a wonderful novelist, and friend of Henry James, and she's just amazing. And she made a fortune as a novelist. So she's a really high art novelist making a fortune. So good on her. She also had a fortune going in, so double good on her. And she received essentially no education, like zero, because she was a woman at that time. What would you educate her for? So she basically educated herself and just became this brilliant, just really great novelist. If you like her style of novels, you'll love. She has lots, and you'll love them. Check her out. But so that is an educational question. How did she do that? Can other people mimic that? Could students use the Wharton method, right? If there is a method, like how did she do that? That would be an interesting educational question. How did she create this great mind that she had and augment it and expand it and explore it? Administrative questions are not that's again. And so if you can start disambiguating this in your mind, and anytime somebody says, "Oh, this education problem," go, "Ooh, pause." Is this an administrative issue or a learning issue? And once you start getting that clarity, you'll realize that there are problems, absolutely, but many times what's being presented are not actually education problems. They're something else entirely. So, don't want to be too negative on administration, but boy, you can see the structure and logic of it is sort of relentless and creates a lot of the issues that we face in education today. Thank you very much.